Sometimes what you need as a writer isn't big picture advice about your whole entire plot, and it's not like the nitty-gritty little tiny details about punctuation or words or something. Instead, you need something in the middle. Chapter level advice, scene level advice, and that's what we're talking about today. If you pay close attention to these 8 writing techniques, you are going to be flabbergasted by how much they help you with your book. So let's get started with technique number 1, which is try artificial suspense. Now, just because I said the word artificial, you might think like, oh, this is a bad thing, right? I should avoid it. No, you should absolutely use this. Artificial suspense is when you have a scene without a lot of tension or action. So what do? You feint some danger in order to get the reader invested and a little bit worried. A great example of this would be Yu Nesba's book, The Redbreast, which is this crime novel. There's a scene where 2 cops are waiting for a presidential motorcade to pass, and it's kind of a boring scene because they're just doing a lot of talking. So Nesba injects some artificial suspense by having a call come over the radio saying, hey, there's an unmarked car near where they're driving past, and now we're worried that that's going to be an assassination attempt. Now, 1 page later, it was revealed that that was just the Secret Service's car. There's no cause for concern. But for that page, the reader was on a higher alert. They were reading more intently, just a little bit more worried about what was going to happen. Now, you can't do that too often or else the reader's going to feel like you're cheating them. But every once in a while, it's a good technique to keep the reader's interest high. And let me extend an invitation to join Bookfox Lab, where we have writers from all stripes writing sci-fi and fantasy and thrillers and literary and romance. Whatever you're writing, there's a space for you in the lab. We would love to help you write and publish your book so you can hold it in your hands. Check out the link below because we have another cohort starting very soon. The second writing technique that you need in your novel is number 2, linger in the decisive moment. So the decisive moment is actually an art term coined by Henri Cartier-Bresson. And he came up with it by looking at things like Rodin's The Kiss sculpture, which captures that moment just before the kiss happens. And he came up with it by looking at art like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, where you have God and Adam almost touching. It's just the moment before they touch, but it's not quite there. So what does this teach us as fiction writers? It's that when you reach a really critical moment in your novel, you want to do 2 things. 1, you want to slow down, right? Slow down right before it actually happens. And then 2, you also want to consider interrupting just before that decisive moment happens. So a classic example of this would be the short story Bullet in the Brain by Tobias Wolff. So half of the short story takes place after the bullet is shot and as it is traveling through a man's skull. For 7 paragraphs, basically a page and a half, this man is not quite dead, but he's right about to be dead. So the major mistake that authors make is they think, oh, this is a decisive moment, I'm gonna rush through it so the pacing feels really fast. And no, you want to slow down, you want to linger. And in this short story, what he does is he goes into all the backstory of this man's life in those 7 paragraphs, and he has a kind of epiphany as the bullet is racing through his brain. Now, the second technique that I mentioned is to interrupt the decisive moment right before it happens. And the classic example of this is 2 characters are just about to kiss, and then, someone barges in or they're interrupted in some way, and it doesn't quite happen. It definitely ups the tension for the reader and also makes them anticipate the moment when they actually will kiss in the future. This next technique is one of my favorite in this entire video. It is number 3, the omission tactic. So what if you just talked around something rather than actually naming it directly? What does that do for the reader? Well, it creates this little micro mystery where they're trying to figure out, like, what exactly are you talking about? And then you finally reveal, oh, this is what I've been talking about all along. So Sandra Cisneros does this multiple times in her novel, The House on Mango Street. There's a whole chapter where the protagonist talks about what her name is. She says she shares a name with her grandma, what her name means in both English and in Spanish, how people say her name at school as though it hurts their mouths, and how her name has 9 letters. Now, we get all this information and we still don't know what is your name. And then at the end of the chapter, she finally says, my name's Esperanza. Later on, another chapter starts talking about something which isn't named, and why don't you take a guess about what she's talking about? One day you will wake up and they are there. If you don't get them, you turn into a man. These things are good for a baby. Now, this is a coming of age book about a young woman, so you're thinking like, she's talking about boobs, right? But no, she's actually talking about hips, and she reveals that a few paragraphs in. So if you can create these little micro mysteries in your story, it'll hook the reader just for a couple paragraphs until they reach the little revelation and they're like, oh, that's what they were talking about all along. This next technique you can use throughout your entire book. It is number 4, bookend your scenes. Honestly, this is such a brilliant technique, but a lot of writers don't employ it. It is a great idea to bookend your scenes in your novel. And what that means is you have something at the beginning of the scene. Could be a gesture, it could be a word, it could be a joke, it could be an object. And then you go throughout the entire scene and then you echo that same thing at the end of the scene. For an example of this, look at Gillian Flynn's Dark Places. At the beginning of a scene, she is visiting a person in prison, and that person puts their hand on the glass and indicates she should do the same, but she refuses. But then at the end of the scene, because of what's happened in the conversation between them, she gingerly puts one finger on the glass, sort of indicating, okay, she's gotten a little bit closer to this person. Here's another example from a new show on Apple called Pluribus. There's two friends at a bar, and the woman drinking a Diet Coke attempts a cheers with the one drinking a martini, and the martini one refuses. And then they have this whole conversation, and then at the end of the scene, there is another cheers attempt, and this time they both clink glasses. So those two scenes aren't bookended, they're also showing progress, going from reluctance to sort of grudgingly going along with things. So look for places in your book where you can bookend scenes either with a similar line of dialogue, or a reference back to a previous joke, or even focusing on the same object at the beginning and the end. You're gonna absolutely love this next point. It is number 5. Don't give away big information for free. In the Woods by Tanya French, which by the way is one of the novels that we're learning from in Bookfox Lab, there's a bit of a mystery why this very young and inexperienced woman gets promoted to the murder squad. And murder squad is the one investigating the murders, not committing the murders, if that wasn't clear. Now as an author, you could just go ahead and tell the reader the reason why she got promoted, but that wouldn't be very much fun. Instead, what French does is she has all these people gossip and speculate on how this woman possibly could have gotten promoted. Maybe she was sleeping with someone important, maybe she caught someone important buying drugs from her when she was doing undercover work, maybe her family are Masons and they threatened to dissolve the squad if she wasn't hired. Finally, we learn the real reason, and it's because she got stabbed in the line of duty and got to choose what her next assignment was. So what's the takeaway for writers? You want to provide wrong answers before you provide the right one. What that does is it creates this journey for the reader rather than just sort of this delivery mechanism of correct information. And I'll also say that all those wrong answers reveal the biases of the other detectives on the squad. They're all thinking like, oh, this was nepotism in some way, and no, she just earned her spot. And lastly, you should use this technique because it really mirrors the way that we often get information in the real world. We don't often get like the right answer right away. We hear all these other rumors and misinformation, and then finally we're like, oh, that's what actually happened. All right, now it's time to look at point number 6, which is use Chekhov's echo. So Chuck Wendig makes this point in his book, Damn Fine Story, and he makes this point that Chekhov's gun isn't just about guns, it's about any element in your story. When you have something appear in your story, it's a promise to the reader that that's going to have impact later on, it's going to echo in some way later on in the story. So toward the beginning of Die Hard, there's this moment where he's scrunching his toes in the carpet, and then the terrorists arrive and, somehow he doesn't get his shoes back on. Later on, there is this moment, perhaps one of the most pivotal moments in the whole movie, where there's all this broken glass on the floor and he has to run barefooted across the broken glass. It shows what he's willing to do to win, and it also shows the real cost of this battle. So the first scene is really about the comfort of bare feet, and then later on you have this echo of, okay, here's bare feet in the most miserable pain you could possibly imagine. Even worse than stepping on Legos. Yeah, I think broken glass would hurt more. I mean, a little bit more. So any type of object you have in your novel, look for places later on where you can revisit that object in a fresh, new, or original way. It can be an echo, it could be a contrast, and the reader's gonna remember like, oh yeah, we did that earlier in the novel. Now you do not want to miss out on point number 7, which is triage your character's backstory. So when you know an absolute ton about a certain character, I think there's this natural impulse to want to just dish it upon the reader as soon as possible, like in the first chapter or two. But instead, what I recommend you do is to triage your character backstory. Come up with a list of a whole bunch of things that have happened in your character's past, and then figure out which are the ones you want to put at the very beginning, and then slowly go down the list, revealing them periodically throughout your novel. For an example of this, look at Jay McInerney's novel, Bright Lights, Big City. At the beginning, we just get to know the character as he is right now, meaning he is a party goer and he is using a lot of cocaine. And then as the story progresses, we learn more about his backstory. Recently, he had a marriage end, and it ended very badly, and he's really torn up about it. But then, most of the way through the novel, we realize what caused his marriage to dissolve, and it was the death of his mother that sent him into into this sort of spiral of depression. So as you're trying to triage your character's backstory, I have 3 tips for you. 1, it'd be a good idea to try to make each step a little bit more intimate. Meaning, if you were talking to a stranger in the bar, what would be the last thing that you would tell them? That would be the type of thing you'd want to have toward the end of the book. You also want each element of that character's backstory just to reveal a little bit more about the psychology and the motivations of that character. Backstory has no place in your story unless it affects the present moment story. And my last point would be, make sure to space out these sort of revelations about character backstory throughout your book. You don't need to front load them all in the first third of your book. Have one of these big revelations come 2/3 of the way through your book. And lastly, the final writing technique of this video is number 8. Give your villain an evil ideology. Let me ask you a question. Do you have a whole framework for what your antagonist or your villain believes? Thanos argues that genocide is great for population control. Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest believes in institutional control through manipulation and dehumanization. Voldemort, he champions blood purity and pure blood. The Daleks in Doctor Who view other species as inferior and they just want to exterminate. And the judge in Blood Meridian believes that all that matters is power, not morality. Now, if you're writing more of an antagonist who isn't particularly evil, you can still give them sort of a dialed down version of this. For instance, say a husband and wife are divorcing and the wife thinks that the husband believes that he's the most important person in the world, right? A sort of narcissism. Okay, that's not exactly, eugenics or genocide or something, but it's still a bad belief that is obviously causing friction between them. My recommendation would be first to select whatever that ideology is that your antagonist believes, and then second, to make sure that you give them the space to actually articulate it in dialogue to another character. But the great danger with this technique is that you end up straw manning it, right? You sort of like have them say it, but it's not really what they would say in that particular circumstance. You want to have them make the absolute best case they can for this idea, and then still have the reader say like, that's an awful thing to think. How could you? If you want help with your novel, don't forget to click the link below to check out Bookfox Lab. We are doing amazing things in this mentorship program and people are taking great strides towards getting that book published. And good luck to everyone watching this video, working hard on their stories. I hope you have a wonderful writing week.